Thank you all for being here. This is a wonderful event where we celebrate invention. And so I'm excited to have the opportunity to host this panel as moderator. If you're like me, you perhaps looked at the title and said, I wonder what that means, specifically the conscious-led economy. So that is the teaser. We will be covering that and talking a bit about what that means, and I'm sure there are many different perspectives on that. So I did want to give some context for the panel. We really feel, if you look around the world and the globe, that we're moving into a more inclusive, diverse, convergence really driven economy. And so we thought it was timely to consider the role of patents and how patents enable or perhaps even impede this evolution. So the pandemic, obviously, as we well know, had enormous implications on our economy, ones that were predictable, ones that were highly unpredictable and surprising. And it's not really clear to me if we are undergoing a societal shift towards more collaboration, a more collaborative mindset, or if we're headed towards societal rifts, or perhaps both. It does seem obvious there's a reorganization of personal priorities. If you think about your own life post-pandemic versus pre-pandemic, it also seems apparent that this is coupled with rising corporate focus on environmental, social, and corporate governance, ongoing, and then perhaps enhanced by the pandemic. So with this as context, I'd like to start a discussion on the role of patents in this evolving landscape. And we have an outstanding panel that you've briefly met to talk about this. And this is a little bit different, the format of this panel. So I think we have a breadth of opinions and ideas, and hopefully you'll join in. We've allotted 20 minutes at the end of the panel to be able to talk with each other. So I hope you'll think about the different perspectives and allow it to provoke your thoughts and provoke conversation. So I'll introduce the panelists again. So George Smith to my immediate left, on the left side of the seating, trained with a Nobel laureate and then went on to win his own Nobel Prize as well. He has had a long history at the University of Missouri, or Mizzou as we know it, and claims he retired in 2015. I don't believe it. And so he is here with us today, very passionate about the topic of patents as well, and obviously scientific endeavor. Then moving to his right, as you see it, is Adam Vasquez, who is an economist. And so bringing a very different perspective. He's the founder of Merit, which is a market invention company, and he currently serves as the CEO. And in that capacity, he's worked as a consultant to many large corporations like General Motors, the Hershey Company, Bank of America, the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. So again, a very different perspective on the role of patents as well. And then on the far right is a familiar face to FNAI, Andrei Iancu, who is an intellectual property partner currently at Irell and Manella. Prior to joining the firm, you may recognize him as the Undersecretary of Commerce for Intellectual Property and Director of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. That's an office that has approximately 13,000 employees and over $3.5 billion annual budget. So quite an enterprise and an outstanding and most valued partner of the National Academy of Inventors. By way of further background, he previously was an engineer, so he brings that perspective as well. So again, I mentioned this will be slightly different panel format, so I'm going to ask George to come to the podium and really put a position out there, and then he'll return to the panel seating, and we'll start to dissect the position as well as some other thoughts that evolve from that. So with that, George, please.
I'm going to sit here.
And George says he would like to sit right there, so we're going to go with that. That works too.
Here's what I think, in light of my personal experience as a supposed inventor. Scientific discoveries and technological innovations emerge from global communities of interacting scientists. Individual scientists or groups make important contributions, to be sure, but those contributions are incremental. Only when they're freely shared with the larger community so they can augment and recombine with the incremental contributions of others to significant scientific advances emerge. As for evolution in the natural world, there's a huge element of chance in the evolution of scientific advances. Louis Pasteur famously said, "Chance favors the prepared mind." But a more honest assessment would be that it is chance, the happenstances of a scientist's personal intellectual history, that prepares the mind to make some incremental step that turns out, but only in retrospect, to be significant. Free dissemination of scientific ideas and resources also mediates science's primary reward system. I'm not talking about financial compensation for our labor. I'm talking about a highly valued cultural reward, acquiring the esteem and respect of our scientific peers. We crave recognition for our work, recognition we strive to earn by explaining our ideas clearly to our students and colleagues in written and spoken word, by supporting our ideas with well-planned workmanlike experiments, by distributing the resulting material resources freely among our fellow scientists. Is this not an estimable ambition and one that depends on our diligence rather than chance, the incredible good luck of a Nobel Prize or similar cultural jackpot? But who's to know of our work if we don't make its results freely available to our scientific community? We're a competitive lot, to be sure, but we can only compete by cooperating. In short, only our modest, incremental contributions to science can legitimately be claimed as our personal intellectual property. But that property is valuable, key to our cultural well-being. However, its value disappears if we don't make it freely available to our scientific communities. Or does it? I needn't explain to this audience that when we talk of intellectual property in public discourse today, we're referring to a completely different sort of intellectual property than I've been discussing so far. We're referring to patent monopolies that government promised to businesses in hope of stimulating commercial innovation. Copyrights are also intellectual property, but I'll focus on patent monopolies. A business holding a patent monopoly is allowed to withhold key information, trade secrets, from potential competitors, and has exclusive use of the limited information in the public patent disclosure. The value of this type of intellectual property requires not making information or resources freely available, so the businesses don't have to face competition for the duration of the patent that allows it to charge monopoly prices that far exceed competitive market prices. Do companies deserve patent monopolies for their products? And is the promise of patent monopolies the best way for governments to foster innovation? You probably won't be surprised that my answer to both questions is no. I'm going to consider two industries that differ in a key respect that I'll explain later. First, the pharmaceutical industry. Most capitalist governments today, especially the US federal government, are extremely averse to taxing their citizens. They prefer to stimulate drug development by the promise of government-granted patent monopolies rather than by direct government spending. Let's take an exemplary arena of particular salience today, the development of the spectacularly effective RNA vaccines against SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus by Moderna in partnership with the US National Institutes of Health, the NIH, and by BioNTech in partnership with Pfizer. These RNA vaccines are the fruit of a focused initiative that has been ongoing now for almost 30 years in many laboratories across the globe, almost all of them publicly funded. And that 30-year initiative has relied in turn on critical discoveries and advances by thousands of publicly funded research groups in immunology, virology, cell and molecular biology, chemistry, physics, other disciplines over a span of at least a century. What justice is there in granting intellectual property rights to all these advances to a handful of corporations who are only responsible for a few final steps in the vaccine's development? What justice is there in forcing citizens or their governments to pay monopoly prices for vaccines that in large part emerged from academic research that was funded with their taxes? Is there a better, a fairer way to stimulate the development of vaccines, indeed of pharmaceuticals in general? A number of capitalist economists believe it would be much better to replace the promise of government-granted monopolies with direct public funding of drug development. That's the type of funding that already sustains the exploratory research that's responsible for all but a few final steps in the development of most new vaccines and pharmaceuticals. The funding would have to be tailored to the tasks that the pharmaceutical corporations are primarily responsible for. Highly focused optimization of the leads that emerge from publicly funded exploratory research, development of safe, effective manufacturing processes, and the animal and human trials that are required for regulatory approval. Probably the funding would be in the form of long-term contracts in broad areas of concern in order to preserve corporate flexibility. All results and resources would be made publicly available as soon as feasible so that scientists and other corporations and institutions can benefit from them immediately. The contractor's performance and their prospects for contract renewal would be based on the usefulness of their results to society. No patents would be allowed on the drugs that result from their work. Those drugs would immediately become generic, sold at generic drug prices. The contractors would thus join the great global community of science, whose creativity depends on the free exchange of ideas and resources. To be sure, the contractors, like us academic scientists, would compete. They'd compete vigorously with one another for contracts. But again, like us academic scientists, they could only compete by cooperating. Let's do the math. The cost of research and development in the US pharmaceutical industry was about $100 billion last year, a little more than twice the NIH budget and less than 1/8 of the military budget. In the same year, US citizens, their insurers, or their governments paid the pharmaceutical industry about $500 billion for drugs. If the $100 billion of research and development costs were financed publicly, as I've just outlined, all drugs would be sold at generic prices, amounting approximately to another $100 billion. The net savings would be about 60%, or $300 billion, $900 for every person in the country. And analogous savings could be expected in other rich countries as well. The stunning achievements of the drug industry are justly celebrated today. Immunotherapies for cancers and autoimmune diseases, for example, and now the outstandingly effective RNA vaccines. Can we expect such triumphs to continue if the pharmaceutical industry's income were slashed by 60%? I think so. Remember that we're not talking about reducing the industry's actual research and development budget. That 60% doesn't go to research and development or to manufacture and distribution. It goes to premier class advertising campaigns, to intense lobbying efforts, to nonstop proactive intellectual property management, and especially to return for investors. And when we talk about scientific and engineering ambition and entrepreneurship, which is what would matter for publicly funded drug development, there's no shortage of that in publicly funded academic exploratory science. Why wouldn't that also be the case for publicly funded drug development? Especially considering that ambitious scientists and engineers would no longer be hampered by the need for corporate secrecy. They'd be actively encouraged as part of their job to work with their colleagues in other companies and institutions, and to publicize their work in journals and conferences, thus earning respect in their scientific communities. It's entirely reasonable to expect this industry-wide community to do a better job of developing new drugs than the current corporate silos. Cutting the market cost of drugs by a factor of 5 from monopoly to generic pricing means that millions of citizens who currently can't afford the drugs they need would now have access to them. I should point out that it's not only people in rich countries who now pay those monopoly prices. A major task, perhaps the major task of the World Trade Organization is to enforce intellectual property rights in all countries, rich and poor alike. This reminds us that vaccines and other drugs are not just commodities like TVs or new running shoes. They're also a public good. And their effective development is not just a matter of commercial prosperity, it's also a matter of basic economic and social justice. For these reasons, pharmaceuticals are a worst-case scenario for advocates of patent monopolies. So how about a better case scenario, like the software industry? Software isn't ordinarily considered a public good, and effective software development isn't ordinarily considered a matter of basic economic and social justice. The Supreme Court first permitted patents for software in 1981 in its Diamond versus Deere ruling. Here's what two prominent libertarian economists, Michele Boldrin and David Levine, write in their book Against Intellectual Monopoly. The context is a patent fight over an innovation that most of us have used, one-click purchasing on Amazon. Some might wonder, they write, how difficult and innovative this invention is, so it may seem a straw man. Whatever the merits of one-click, there are certainly many software inventions that we all agree are important and innovative. There are all the graphical user interfaces, the widgets such as buttons and icons, the compilers, assemblers, linked lists, object-oriented programs, relational databases, search algorithms, font displays, word processing, computer languages, all the vast array of algorithms and methods that go into even the simplest modern program. Not only are these innovations all difficult and important, the fact is that every single one of them is used and is necessary to make the one-click, or for that matter, the two-click, work. Boldrin and Levine continue. We do not describe the role of patents in development of any of these significant innovations for one simple reason. Each and every one of them occurred prior to 1981, and so occurred without the benefit of patent protection. Not only that, had all these bits and pieces of computer programs been patented, as they certainly would be under the current regime, far from being enhanced, progress in the software industry would never have taken place. According to Bill Gates, hardly your radical communist or utopist, quotes, if people had understood how patents would be granted when most of today's ideas were invented and had taken out patents, the industry would be at a complete standstill today, end quote. How fitting to give Bill Gates the last word in the case against patent monopolies. I better stop here.
Thank you, George. So you've given us a lot to chew on there. So thank you for leading off with that. Andrei, I'm going to turn to you and ask for both a general response to some of the thoughts that George has presented, but then also the specific question, should there be what I call an arbitrator of conscience in patents? So for example, the COVID vaccine, should there be some factor of common good that is assessed for specific patenting opportunities? So I'll leave it at that.
Good. Small, tiny question. Well, first of all, great to be with all of you. Great to be with NAI. I think the Academy does tremendous work. And when I was at the USPTO, I was thrilled to be a big supporter of NAI and come to several of these events. Really, congratulations to everything you have done, Paul Sandberg in particular, for your leadership role. Really a pleasure to be with all of you. I didn't expect ever in my life to find myself in this position where I have to disagree with a Nobel Prize laureate. But I'm not going to disagree with him on chemistry or biology. I'll disagree with him in the area that I know about, which is patents and patent law. Look, George puts forward an important thesis that has been at the crux of the debate of any intellectual property system from the very beginning. From the very beginning of this country, remember, the intellectual property clause is in the Constitution. It's the only place in the Constitution that the word right is mentioned. Comes from the exclusive rights provided for in the Constitution for patents and copyrights. Thomas Jefferson said immediately after the passage of the Constitution that patents are an embarrassment to the public, probably for the reasons that George has mentioned. Soon thereafter, though, somehow Jefferson ended up being the first examiner of patents in the United States. He would go home at night and he would have a shoebox with him and take the patents and work on them at night and then, allow or disallow them, whatever examiners do. And within a few months, he said, patents have given a spring to invention beyond my comprehension. So you see the dilemma, this push and pull of the patent system in one human being there in Jefferson, but it's been at the core of any intellectual property system. But here's what I know. I know for a fact that we have generated over the past 250 years tremendous technological progress in this country and around the world. That is a fact. What I don't know, while George's plausible alternative environment might work, and he says he doesn't think it would harm the pharmaceutical industries, the words, critical words there, I think, George, are you don't think, but there is no current evidence of that, and the stakes are too high to experiment. Let's put things in perspective. Human beings have been on this planet for millions of years. Well, I don't know what the number is, frankly, but for sure, they've been organized in societies for thousands of years, across time and across the globe. And yet, just at the founding of this country, 250 years ago, we wouldn't have these lights here. Just 250 years ago, we would be here by candlelight. And we would have arrived here by horse and buggy. And if you needed anesthesia, talk about pharmaceuticals, your best bet just 250 years ago would have been a shot of whiskey, at best. Right?
Maybe some cannabis.
Okay. Now I know what his thesis is going to be when I stop talking. So, I mean, those are facts. The fact is that just 250 years ago when this country was founded, the state of the human condition was effectively the same as in antiquity, as in ancient Greece. So I'm not saying that all this progress is due to the constitutional patent system here in the United States. What I am saying is that we have had all this progress at the same time as the patent system. Now, I personally believe, but you don't have to believe the way I do, you just can look at just the facts that they coexisted. I personally believe that the patent system did, in fact, act as the catalyst to this tremendous human growth that no time in history has ever been seen. Because remember, there is a distinction between pure scientific research that George was addressing at the very beginning, and I agree with him on those points, that pure scientific discoveries are motivated by other things. There's a difference between that on the one hand and industrial practical applications of those discoveries once found. And I very much believe that for the industrial practical applications of what these scientists discover in the lab, what you need in the free market economy is a system of incentives and protections to enable the transfer of that technology from the lab to the market. It's counterintuitive, but if it's free for all, okay? I forget the exact phrase you had, George, I think, but free for the world. I think, in fact, the effect would be the opposite. It wouldn't transfer. Because take a pharmaceutical company, for example. In order to take that technology, that's the scientific discovery that's developed in the lab, and actually create a product out of it, you need to build factories. You need to create product lines, get FDA approvals, huge clinical trials. On average, it costs over $2 billion to get a successful drug to market in the United States. Where is that investment coming from? If you do not have, if those companies cannot count on the protections of a patent system, that once successful, they won't be appropriated. George's thesis is that the government can step in and substitute for the free market system. Other countries have tried this. Before the United States even existed, England, Great Britain, they basically had a system of prizes. They had a patent system, but it was practically a crown prize to their preferred subjects. And what happens is, in the more modern times, obviously the centralized governments, the Soviet Union, and so on, have tried this with government subsidies. There is a reason why the United States is the leader of this technological revolution for the past couple of 100 years. This is my belief. But the bottom line, though, is you don't have to take my word for it. I think it's too risky in the face of the upcoming needs of humanitarian needs to take the risk and experiment for the first time in our history with a system that's unproven, when we know that we have done tremendous good for humanity with a system that we do have. To Karen's last or only question, which I haven't answered yet, should there be an arbiter of conscience? My personal view is that I don't think the legal system is the place for that. There might be, there could be, and humans can act in, can create benevolent societies and all of that, but pro bono societies, take the COVID vaccine, for example. COVAX, that's organized an international organization for collecting from wealthy countries vaccine doses for distribution out to the developing world. That is a benevolent system, a voluntary system. Systems like that can be created. We can do better than that, even, and we can do a lot more. But I don't think the patent laws themselves or the intellectual property laws should be modulated that way, because then you're picking winners and losers, and you're interfering with the free market economy. Government should have an even state of law that applies equally to all technologies and under all circumstances, and then the free market can react appropriately, both from an economics point of view and from a consciousness point of view.
Great, thank you. Adam, you're not off the hook.
Right.
So I have a question for you, and it's leading back to the title of the session, Conscious-Led Economy. So I'd love it if you'd say more about that. How do we as a society agree on what's conscious? Do we have to start with that discussion and debate? And then we heard earlier today the National Science Foundation talking about user-inspired innovation. Is that equivalent to conscious-led, or is one necessarily the same as the other, or is one encompass the other? So I'll throw those out there by way of starting point for discussion.
Sure. So again, thanks for having this conversation. I think the fact that we can have differing opinions and have this conversation is proof of consciousness in itself. In this time and age when it seems to be polarizing is the way to go, and it can't talk and meet in the middle and have these dialogue. And I think we need to have this conversation, so thank you. So consciousness in itself, again, that's a very broad question, and philosophers have been debating this since we were self-aware. And so when we think of consciousness, I think most people think of it as ESG, inclusion and diversity, all of those good things. But I think that is surface level. Actually, I know it's surface level. When we're talking about consciousness, it's the understanding, the basic understanding that, there was the discussion earlier around, hard AI and talking about the brain versus neuroscience and all of that. And neuroscience is breaking this topic wide open right now. But the idea that our brain and mind are separate. How are we doing? I can talk loud too, that's okay. All right. So the idea that our mind and brain are separate, and we can debate this, but I think there is a knowingness of anybody who has touched consciousness and understands what it is. And let's go to the topic of the Great Resignation. So society has evolved, and as we evolve through self-discovery and learning ourselves and getting connected to our higher selves, we have discovered consciousness that is here. Not everybody is. It's a spectrum, and it's a learning curve, and we're all learning. However, what is happening, and this is a major trend and an economic trend, everybody's focused on resignation, the Great Resignation, but it's the Great Awakening. And people are becoming more aware that their thoughts create their reality, that this is actually more of a holographic, three-dimensional world of shared ideas and thoughts. And the fact that right now, the discussion we are having right now is actually based on, previous thoughts. So we're actually working in the past. And as inventors, every great invention comes from the unknown. So for us, just to consider a couple things. First, what is consciousness? Consciousness is that self-awareness, that knowing that I'll go there, we're all infinite, and this is all just time construct, and Einstein proved this. It's all stacked on itself, happening at the same time. So if we can all agree to that, then, and we can agree to that high level of consciousness is based on love, and a low level consciousness is based on fear and scarcity, then we can also agree that even the idea of competition is a scarcity mindset, low consciousness being. So when we start going on that, then what is the purpose of patents? And the purpose of patents, in many ways, from my belief, is really to protect those who have an idea that are trying to share it with the world from those who are still operating at a lower level of consciousness. And in the United States, as interesting research out there by former David Hawkins, who mapped consciousness, you can agree with it or not in the methodology, but it's still very interesting. When we think about that level of consciousness, I'm off, so I'm just going to talk loud. Okay. So when we think about that lower level of consciousness and that mapping of consciousness with the high level frequency versus the low level frequency, and when our thoughts are creating our future state of reality, and then our discussion should be not about patents, it should be about, as entrepreneurs and inventors, if we're going to take at a higher level of consciousness, or we're going to come from a fear and scarcity based mindset. And my humble opinion on that is long-term patents are irrelevant, because they're driven by two things: scarcity, somebody stealing your stuff, and ego. Both are lower selves. And I think if we're intellectually honest with ourselves, I think we can have that conversation. And if your ego is telling you to disagree with Adam on stage right now, well, that's your perspective, and that's fine, because there's nothing wrong with that, because consciousness doesn't judge. It just is. It just wants to experience. So as we think about that, I think the point is that I think both are right. I don't think the government there should be no arbiter of consciousness. That sounds scary in 1984 and Big Brother type stuff. That is up to the individual inventor who has the idea. And here's the other part, is if you really believe in consciousness and you go all in on this topic, then all ideas are public domain. Because if all time happens at the same time, then you just pluck that idea out of the sky and brought it to manifest it into reality. Because we're living manifestation, we're living this manifested reality based on previous thoughts. So So just something to consider. So government, I believe that this should not be leading the consciousness discussion. It's good to be a ref and be independent. I believe in free market, and I believe that both of my colleagues are right in the fact that we do need to protect IP, but I do believe we need to protect IP from bad players. And we do need to understand what is the best interest of public domain versus not, and build off of that, because open source is great. And I would say this, I don't believe that patents has created this explosion in innovation. I think it was a law that all laws are behind the times. Usually they're lagging regardless. I do believe it's just a law of compounding, and everything's accelerating now, including our own understanding of consciousness. In fact, we're having this conversation. I don't think we could have this conversation in the past. So I just, I'll leave it there. And we can go much deeper.
Great. So I'm looking at the clock, and there are 18 minutes remaining, which are 18 minutes for you. And so I'd invite you to come to the microphones. I think there's one over there and one here to ask questions. So, yes.
So let me tell two stories. I was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame back in 2002, and then I served on the selection committee for roughly a decade. And I have two big memories. Fritz Haber, who got a US patent on how to make ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen. He later won the Nobel Prize. So he was nominated. But Fritz Haber led the German introduction of poison gas into the trenches in World War I. Now, they started with chlorine and then later with nitrogen mustard. But as we discussed it, nitrogen mustard was not only a terrible poison, it was the first chemotherapy agent. So is Fritz Haber good or bad? Now, his institute in 1924 created the best insecticide. Now, Fritz himself was discovered to be Jewish. He left and died in 1934. But the insecticide was Cyclone B. You know what Cyclone B is. So should Fritz Haber be inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame or not? So we had a huge discussion, and there were two people who were absolutely deadly opposed to this, but we ended up voting 11-2 in favor of inducting Fritz Haber. I think of it like if O.J. Simpson were not in the National Football Hall of Fame, and it came up now, would we induct him into the National Football Hall of Fame despite what happened afterwards? That's just a little story. The second one was Jonas Salk was nominated. Now, Jonas Salk had some patents in the later years having to do with HIV, but it was pointed out that he decided not to patent his Salk vaccine so it would be available to the public at large. And then Sabin, who came up with the next version of the polio vaccine, copied Jonas Salk, and he didn't patent his polio vaccine either, so it would be available to the public at large. We did induct, I'm pretty sure we inducted Jonas Salk for the later patents because he was a great person. But this type of discussion took a lot of time when we were deciding who should be inducted or not. So these are just some memories I have of weighing the value of the patent versus everything else that went on.
Yeah. Not easy discussions, are they? Takes time. If you'd like to comment, this is working.
Oh, great. Well, I might mess it up. Let's see. I think it's a good example of if you leave it up to the individual inventor, again, it depends on their level of consciousness and how evolved they are and how they think, and if they're coming from a scarcity versus an abundance mindset, right? I think, it's theirs to decide what they want to do, I would argue, and the ethics of the application of a patent after the fact and people using it, I mean, you can see that in both open source and closed source. There's multiple uses. I mean, we looked at the cancer treatment from today. We saw a keynote today discussing about one application of cancer treatment. So I guess it just reinforces, in my humble opinion, of just the fact that government really shouldn't decide if it's a patent or not. It's not for us to say this, but it is up to the individual, and the free market will determine that, right?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I agree with what he just said. There's nothing wrong with any inventor dedicating the patent to the public, like Jonas Salk did, or not seeking a patent at all, or just doing open source. Open source, by the way, is another form of IP. It has its own requirements, and so on. But the point is, remember, a patent is not just a form of protection or a form of incentive. The biggest issue about the patent system is to coax the would-be inventors to put forward their ideas to the public. I don't agree that an idea is inherently in the public domain. It really isn't. It's in your head. And if you don't put it out, the public doesn't have it. They don't know about it. It's in here. So how do you get it as a society? How do we get it out of the individuals, out of companies? And it's the opposite of a trade secret, right? How do you make the companies not retain all this technology as a trade secret and instead putting it out under the promise that for a limited time, they are going to be protected? You can have other promises too if you want to change the system, but that's the whole point of trying to bring stuff out to the public so the next guy or gal can improve upon it and come up with something potentially better and so on in an exponential fashion.
Thank you for your
Thank you.
question. We'll switch to the opposite side of the room, sir.
Thank you. Karen, George, Andrei, and Adam, thank you for having this conversation and for putting forward this question. This is a perfect place to discuss this amongst those who are actually inventors. And I'm very grateful that you brought it forward. Again, sorry, I don't know if I mentioned this, James Conley from Northwestern, but I have a couple of questions. One is, there was an inventor among us who was a lawyer who wasn't a Nobel Prize winner, but he had a pretty good view of how the system works in this country. This is a historical point. His name was Abraham Lincoln, and his view of it was that the patent system brings the fuel of interest to the fire of genius. So my first question is, everyone in this room is in the business of the fire of genius. And the fuel of interest that he was referring to was funds. But at that time, and even to this day in your pharmaceutical industry context, those are private funds. I don't know about you, but I'm a lot more careful about my money than I am about the public's money. Hence the scrutiny about how those funds are used is under a higher degree of review. I wonder if that figures into the calculus of your proposal. Second, the point about Amazon and one click. I'm a faculty member in a business school, and we tell students to be resourceful about how they organize for advantage. And Amazon did exactly that. They never got that patent granted in anything but one country. So it wasn't the patent that they were after. It was the 63 different trademarks that they got. And they still capture money from licensing the word one click. So business students are pretty clever. We're not the Ph.D. engineers, but we figured out how to pursue advantage. So if you decide to undercut the patent system, we're going to find it in other places. And I wonder what you think about these 2 points, especially as they formed part of the calculus of your thesis.
George, would you like to respond?
I will ask something after you.
Yes, George, I'd be happy to hear your answer.
I just think the fire was the fire of ambition and
The fuel of interest to the fire of genius.
I was not talking about, remember that I said that I wasn't talking about the remuneration for your labor. I was talking about the spark of innovation. And I think that spark, it's not different for developers than for, like academic scientists. I think it's fundamentally the same thing. And the funds, really, that's the debate. If it's something in a government interest, Why doesn't the government pay for it? Basically, that's the case for pharmaceuticals. And if it's not a public good, what does the government have to step in and put its power behind that, behind the funding for that? If it's such a good idea, it seems to me the funds will come and they'll compete. They'll be better than the other person, than the other company.
Without the patent.
Without the patent. I mean, the software industry, open source abounds in the software industry. Think of Linux, for example. I mean, and there are many people making huge amounts of money out of open source software. No government and patents are
The
allowed.
biggest open source software project on the planet is called Chromium. That's
Chromium?
open source run by Google. And every single thing that Google does is protected by the trademark on the word Chrome.
Well, okay. All right. So if you protected by.
Well, so I just want to add something.
Adam.
I just want to add something to this point. And we're not having, that debate, I would argue, was a bit low on a consciousness level. And I'm not saying it was in a bad debate. I think it illustrates the point that of the fear of scarcity and the fear of somebody else making more money on your idea or your work, right, or your effort. My understanding, and from my own life experiences and what I've researched extensively, is that the money comes. People, if you're a slave to money, you're saying that you're not worthy. Money is higher and more worthy than you are. And I'm not saying that you don't have a bad relationship with money. Money's, like oxygen. But what I am saying is the fact that, if you ask yourself the question, oh, I need to patent this because I want to be recognized, or I don't want somebody to steal it because they're going to take my money and all this stuff and everything else, that is actually a lower vibration and a lower consciousness level when you're solving the problem. And I just say that anybody in this room, I would argue, even including myself, when I make a decision based off of fear or scarcity, it ends up biting me in the ass immediately or later down the road. Always. So that's something to consider.
Thank you. We'll move to this side of the room.
Yeah, so the fundamental problem, by the way, I'm Rock Mackey, Wisconsin. The fundamental problem is that large multinational corporations aren't really interested in disruptive technology. If you left it to existing large corporations, there'd be slow incremental innovation, which sometimes is fine. But let me give you an example. I'm a Canadian. When I finished my Ph.D., I had a very good idea for radiation therapy treatment planning. The company that was selling the world's leading treatment planning software was a Canadian multinational and is subsidized by the Canadian government. So I wrote them and said, I've got a great idea. I'd like to come to work for your company. I think this algorithm was going to really change the field of radiation therapy. And they said, no, we're not interested in hiring right now. So anyway, a few years later, I found myself at Wisconsin, and a small group, labored away for a long time to write a treatment planning system. And at that point, we were trying to give it away for free. And the FDA said, you can't give it away for free. You can use it at Wisconsin, but if anyone else wants to use it, it has to be FDA approved. So I went to the university and said, gee, I think it'd be about $1 million it'll take me to get this FDA approved. Well, I was wrong. I was a stupid academic. And so anyway, to make a long story short, I had to start my first company. And I thought it could be done in a year for $1 million. We'd already been working on it for a while. It took many millions, about 3 million, in 3 years to get it FDA approved. Well, that software went on to dominate the radiation therapy treatment planning system. It was truly disruptive. It essentially made future radiation therapy accurate instead of it being crude. And if we hadn't had the ability to protect the copyright on that software, then it would never have happened. We would have never got the investment for it. It wouldn't have happened. We'd probably be still doing radiation therapy pretty much the same way as we were in the 80s. So it really does take some protection over your IP in order to get investment. And even when I, a good socialist Canadian, tried to do it the way you thought it could be done, it just couldn't happen. It won't happen. It can't happen. It's not the way our society works. It doesn't work like that in Canada, and it doesn't work that way here.
So what are you going to say to the person that uses your idea but makes a slight change that makes it way, way better?
Yeah, and it's happened, sure. So it dominated the field for 15 years, and someone else came on with another tweak, and again they were funded. It was a publicly traded Swedish company, and they now dominate the radiation therapy market, and that's fine. That's the way it should be.
Well, we all agree on that, of course. But I'm talking about something that that your patent could prevent them from doing. This one of the biggest.
It wasn't
first
the patent.
patents was Isaac Watt for
it was other IP. It was copyright.
But to be clear, a patent won't prevent you from doing that. A patent prevents you for a limited period of time for you doing the same thing. That approach. See. The whole beauty of this thing is that it actually incentivizes you now to go around it, right? Because if you could actually do the same exact thing, the most natural course is that you're going to try to do the same exact thing, maybe at bigger scale with better marketing, etc. It doesn't incentivize you to go around it. Let me give a very quick example. I know we're running low on time. Electricity. And the Thomas Edison versus George Westinghouse in the late 1800s. Edison had over 1,000 patents. He really had the patent thicket, okay? It drove Westinghouse nuts. So Westinghouse is really upset, okay? And so what does he do? He works with Tesla and he creates a different kind of electricity, right? I'm simplifying a little bit, but he creates AC type circuitry and an AC system as opposed to Edison's DC system. If Edison did not have his patent thicket, I don't know if he would have invented because he was super motivated by financial success. He probably was low on your consciousness level. But
there's nothing wrong with being motivated by financial success.
Okay, but even so, even if he did invent his DC stuff, Westinghouse, who was a huge businessman, he probably would have plowed right into that, and he would have not been incentivized to go around it and come up with something else. Much better, by the way, we're still using it today. We're using the design around, we're using Westinghouse's system. This happens all the time. It happens in the pharmaceutical world. That's why the United States is the leader in this area, and we have more and more drugs as compared to other countries, despite our stronger patent system.
So I would say this, there's been a lot of history thrown out there, and it's fine, but history actually perpetuates more of the same. And so when we focus on what we think in the past to think about how we project in the future, and I'm not talking about compounding and building on innovation and ideas, that's not what I'm talking about, but it's the self-limiting beliefs that hold back where we're trying to go. And what I'm saying, either way, the ship has left the building. This awakening is happening. I see it everywhere. Unemployment rate, I think we saw, 3.2% unemployment rate. That is not because there's people that everybody's employed. It's because people are opting out of this economy and this model that we have. And it's not about going to a socialism or capitalism, that kind of level. It's a conscious-led economy. So how that evolves, and the fact that there are people that we hold on to the history, like there's our belief systems, and we're unwilling to let go of them because that would hurt our own self-awareness of ourselves. You know, that's going to be around for a while. What I can say is generationally, and I look at macro trends, and this is one of the biggest ones that people aren't talking about. We've got to figure out a way to protect from the bad players but create open source and compound it all, because that's what's accelerating.
So I'm going to apologize because we are completely out of time, and I know you gentlemen have been waiting very patiently. The speakers will be available at the next break. I would like to extend a thank you. I think these gentlemen have set a fine example of what it's like to have differences of opinion and to do so in a very civil fashion.